Thank you, Mr. Speaker Pro Tem, and for the gentleman from Pennsylvania. A bit of reference. In the old days, when we were put in the chair, particularly when we were freshmen, it's because we had been annoying to the speaker. So if anyone remembers that. And to the clerk staff, I love you, I appreciate you, and I'm sorry, we're about to do a whole bunch of math and a lot of numbers really fast. But it's where we're at. So, Mr. Speaker, one of the things I'm going to try to do today is basically sell two ideas. One is, and I want to be honest and careful in this because my goal is not to be sarcastic, not to be a jerk, but walk through the scale, just the scale of the borrowing, the debt problem, of our demographics, what's really going on. So I'm going to actually walk through just a couple examples of solutions we get from our wonderful, brilliant constituents and sort of explain they're probably things we should do, but they're tiny rounding errors. People don't understand. I think annually we expect to borrow about $7 billion a day. I think so far this fiscal year we're borrowing about $10 billion a day. The second thing, it's incredibly important, and if there's a staffer out there or a freshman member of Congress, burn what we're going to talk about into your consciousness. The United States, what's the greatest, at least economic threat I think we have for this government, for many ways the country? Interest. We are what's called interest fragile. I'm going to show you some charts where tiny movements on U.S. sovereign debt become trillions and trillions of dollars. Our model basically says we're going to refinance almost $10 trillion this year and add another, two and a third trillion of virgin or new borrowing. And so small bits of interest. So when you hear someone talk about things like the debt ceiling, you got to understand you're weaving a needle while jogging, because you got to deal with it in a way where how do you communicate and do actual policy? It communicates to the world debt markets. The United States is taking its debt seriously and understands the scale of the problem. And then also, while extending that debt ceiling in a way that also doesn't blow you up. And I've had some of my brothers and sisters who go, just don't raise it. Okay, great. Do you think you're ever getting a mortgage again? Do you ever think you're getting a car loan again? Do you understand what would happen to the world economy going boom and interest rates exploding when all of a sudden the United States is no longer creditworthy? Because that's what it means. And remember, one of my predictions for this year is there's three big rating agencies, S&P, Fitch, and Moody's. Moody's is the only one that has not downgraded U.S. debt yet. I predict to you before this year's over, Moody's, so all three will have downgraded U.S. sovereign debt. My other prediction is before this spring is over, the United States will cross over to 5% interest, and if it holds there, I'm going to show you how devastating that math absolutely is. The clown show has to come to an end. People need to understand, if you're a member of Congress, you are the board of the biggest economy in the world. You got to start learning your math, because at the end of the day, the math will always win. So let's do some basic things. Now, first off, part of what I'm doing, the reason I'm doing this is I'm also trying to make the moral argument of doing the really hard thing in reconciliation. The really hard thing is also the best economics. If you give a darn about your retirement, my 2.5-year-old boy's economic future, the country, and forgive me, I'm still working through my lung issues. You got to do the hard thing. So CBO and then my joint economic economists actually worked through some math and saying, what would happen, because we have all these expiring provisions of TCJA, the 2017 tax reform. And if you extend them all So the individuals, the pass-throughs, the small business, the subchapter S's, the partnerships, if you extend those tax provisions over 10 years, it's about 4.6 trillion of revenue that would have come in because of the increased taxes, because of the expired provisions. What is this body able to do to find policies to offset that spending? Well, it turns out CBO, and as I know this chart's a little hard to read, but the punchline on it is if you functionally extend the tax policy, but you pay for it through the decade, you actually get more economic growth, that the economy actually grows. And people go, what, but you reached in and pulled money out to pay for the offsets. The idea is by doing that, you didn't deficit finance it, where you're paying interest, where you're making the debt markets more fragile, and you're also pulling 4.6 trillion additional capital out of the debt markets that could have gone into you buying a new car or the business buying new plant and equipment. This is hard because around here talking about we're going to modernize how we deliver healthcare. We're going to modernize public agencies. We're going to reduce spending by doing it better, faster, and cheaper. There's an army of lobbyists outside the hallway here who are paid to protect their current business models. How many folks do we meet from the agencies and the public employee unions that get all upset, particularly at me when I'm doing these presentations of, here we could use technology, we can use AI, these other things to reduce the size and cost and make government much more responsive. And then they send nasty letters and those things into your district and complain about you. But we don't have a choice. So let's walk through. So the facts are on our side. Those folks that run around here and say, we need to extend tax policy, we need to protect the border, we need to actually do all these things. But you can't create an additional fiscal rat hole and expect you're going to throw this back onto the world debt markets. My reason I want you to think about this, I'm going to show you a couple charts in a little while that where interest rates were on U.S. sovereigns way back when. Let's go back to like December. So a few weeks ago. Yesterday, the 20-year U.S. bond actually crossed over 5% for a while. If 5%, and understand, if anyone with gray hair, you understand 5% is actually lower than the historical average of the previous few decades. If we were just go to 5%, you're going to see that's almost just shy of an additional 9 trillion in debt, double of everything we're talking about doing in reconciliation. So just doing this and communicating to the debt markets that we're serious about what's going on, because the uncomfortable truth, and I'm going to show it again, and it seems to hurt people's feelings, almost 100% of the debt for the next 10 years is interest and Medicare. We got older. Baby boomers are moving into their earned benefits. We didn't have enough children to backfill. Starting in 1990, fertility rates started to roll over. Healthcare got much more expensive. And we're almost terrified to basically say almost every dime of debt from today through the next 30 years is interest and demographics. And the political class, the press, the dopamine hits on cable television, this and that, telling true math doesn't make you popular, but it does make you honest. So let's actually walk through a couple examples. And once again, I got to be careful because these are not meant to be snarky. They're basically a thought experiment of what you hear members walk behind these microphones saying things that, great, they're wonderful, maybe we should do them, but they have tiny effects on the survival of this republic. So let's actually walk through, just explain what I'm talking about. Okay, let's walk through the impact of borrowing. We're using this fiscal year, what we've been borrowing per day, per hour, per minute, per second. But we're going to walk through, and I'm using the clock face, and these are 12-hour clocks. So you got to picture 2 clock faces. I'm trying to make some way where you make things with lots of zeros understandable. So let's actually, and this is one of my favorite ones. So back in December, we sent out some things, and we got members of our community to throw back ideas. And one of the favorite ones was get rid of congressional salaries. Okay. In my heart of heart, I actually think we're overpaid for the quality of our work product. So maybe that's what we should do. But you get rid of every congressional salary. That's Senate here. Just get rid of all of it. It's actually about, over a fiscal year, it's about $1.9 billion. It's a lot of money. Okay? For an entire year's borrowing. For the entire year, it would cover 6.4 hours. Yay! We made a big impact. We covered 6.4 hours of an entire year's worth of borrowing. Okay, so that's sort of silly, but that's one of the key responses we got. I think, actually, may say more about what they think about me. All right, so let's actually do another one that came back to us from our constituent surveys. Emergency services for undocumented migrants. This is basically Obamacare subsidies, healthcare spending for those who are here undocumented. They're illegal. Now, most of this turns out we believe to be Obamacare subsidies. You will hear member after member after member and people on television, the talking hosts, you'll hear it on conservative talk radio. If we just didn't spend money, okay. So we actually did this thing called research, where we actually looked up the actual facts and the math. And it's about $2.7 billion for the entire year. So we get rid of it, and we probably should, but it's 9 hours of borrowing for an entire year. Yet how many times will you hear people say this in front of microphones? Stopping healthcare subsidies for those who are here undocumented, here illegally, is 9 hours of borrowing for an entire year. And there's our problem. We have people doing theater over honest math. So let's do another one. One of my particular favorites. Let's get rid of Department of Education. And actually, I'm a big fan because there's, you know, if you believe in the 10th Amendment of the Constitution, why is this here at the federal government? Yes, but a big portion of their 4,500 employees is actually debt management, but that can be actually done by, you know, other agencies we have that actually have high-skilled folks to manage receivables, those things, bank. But if you got rid of all those 4,500 employees at the Department of Education, great. Turns out to be about $2.75 billion over an entire year you just covered. Functionally, 9 hours of borrowing. Now, how many people have you heard come behind these microphones or on conservative talk radio or other things that are saying, if we get rid of we're going to get rid of the Department of Education? Great. And then the conversation moves on to something else because they act like they've covered the debt. There's this lack of understanding. We're borrowing about $70,000 a second. So let's go on to another one we get of. Let's get rid of the UN. Now, I've done this a couple times, and when I did it before, the total spend on the United Nations was $18.1 billion, but that was actually in the 2023 fiscal year. But that had a bunch of the new construction for the 2024 fiscal year, which has ended already. We spent $12.9 billion on the UN, or maybe it's in this fiscal year, that's what we have appropriated. Okay, $12.9 billion is a lot of money. Let's just get rid of it. We won't, and I'm not going to even give you the other chart that shows you that how much all these foreign diplomats and stuff pay into taxes in their things they buy, the rent, and those things in New York City. Who cares? Okay, but that 12.9 gets me 43 hours. So basically a day and 3/4 of borrowing. And my point is I'm trying to walk through that we're going to probably have to do lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of these things. Start demanding from the people who are standing up in front of you saying, here's what I care about, we're going to take on the debt and deficits, have them understand their math. So how about Ukraine aid? Okay, I think this is on for this fiscal year. So the appropriation lineup is $21.8 billion. Okay, that gets us 3 days of borrowing. And you hear these crazy numbers being thrown out. Turns out now this is both humanitarian and I think actually the other term I often listen, but it's things that provides equipment. Often it's equipment we were depreciated out, we're going to get rid of, we send on to them. So this is both categories in that number of the 21.8. But it's 3 days. So let's actually even add a little bit. Let's go grander. Let's go much more bigly. Is that, I think, a pop culture term these days? Let's just get rid of all foreign aid. I cannot tell you how many times I run into folks back home and say, David, I'm so concerned about the debt and deficit. You know, we can balance everything if we just get rid of foreign aid. Okay. Interesting math. So we did the math. Here's the 57.25 that's going to foreign aid. It's a week of borrowing. Does anyone see the point I'm trying to make? You start to add up all these. And I think in all of those, we got ourselves to, what, a week and a half? We added up all the ideas that came into our office. And I think we got up to like 3 weeks of borrowing. There seems to be this lack of understanding. Every dime a member of Congress votes on is borrowed money. Every dime of defense is borrowed. Every dime of non-defense discretionary. And this year, I'm doing this off the top of my head, which is always dangerous. I think it's about $400-some billion of what we call earned benefits, mandatory spending, is borrowed money. And trying to just demonstrate, so there's this term we do, on-budget receipts. Okay, you got your paycheck. You look at your paycheck. Here's what went to FICA. Well, that's your Social Security contribution, a little bit of your Medicare Part A contribution, maybe a little bit of unemployment disability. Okay. That's sort of considered off-budget tax contributions. That's coming from your FICA tax. The other part is your income tax, capital gains tax, all the other things. That's this blue here. To give you an idea, net interest this fiscal year, the interest we pay back to the people who've been kind enough to buy our bonds. And remember, China is not the #1 owner of bonds. I think now it's Japan, and China's been actually rolling off its bonds for like 3-4 years. I think they're somewhere now in the $800-900 billion range of the $36 trillion in debt we have. Remember, about $28-29 trillion of that is what we sell out to the market. The others we borrow internally. So we borrow the Social Security Trust Fund, we borrow other monies internally, but we still have to pay interest. Which is, you remember, we're one of the only countries in the world that engages in this scam of saying, well, it's only the publicly borrowed money. No, because you owe interest, you're not going to pay your interest back to Social Security? Of course you are. But the point of this chart is trying to say accounting accounts for 24% of all those tax receipts we take in that aren't Social Security, aren't part of those payroll tax. 24% is just going to pay interest, and that's this year. And the crazy thing is these numbers were scored when we thought the mean interest on U.S. sovereign debt was going to be somewhere around the 3 and 3.25. Have you seen what's happened the last 3 weeks? Did I mention a moment ago that the 20-year bond yesterday went over 5%? This number is about to explode on us. It's called interest fragility. And yet, how many idiots like me have come behind the microphone and said, do you understand how dangerous it is if we make the debt markets nervous because we're incompetent? So let's do one more of these. Just to make the point, So this is the tax receipts, fiscal year 24. Okay, so it's a fixed number. That's the last fiscal year. The red here, that's the Social Security taxes, Medicare Part A, da-da-da-da. This was everything else. So even in that case, it's still basically 24% of it's still 24 here. I just did this chart so you could see when you hear someone talk about total tax receipts, this is obligated to earned benefits. And oddly enough, this number isn't big enough to cover the earned benefits. That's why every month Social Security has to present its special T-bills to Treasury, cash in. So remember, Social Security does not add to the debt. Cashing in their special T-bills and the Treasury having to finance it and give the money back to Social Security does add to the debt. Just you remember there's 2 steps in there. So back to the oldie but goodie. You see everything in red? That's on autopilot. Your member of Congress doesn't even vote on it. What's in blue? Non-defense, defense, all borrowed. And a whole wedge of this over here. So understand the scale. And look, it's hard to see 12 zeros in your head, but that's just $1 trillion. We're probably going to borrow $2 1/3 trillion this year. And we have these debates and discussions. Oh, we're going to have to do reconciliation. Yes, of course we are. We still don't have 60 votes in the Senate. If we're going to move policy, of course we are. But understand the fiscal implications if we don't do it right. Does the debt markets demand a premium because you see what's going on around the world? What happened in Great Britain this summer? What they do to the gilt? What happened in France a couple of weeks ago? What's happening in Germany right now? What's happening in Canada? What happened in South Korea? All over the world you see governments falling, and one of the primary reasons they're falling is they actually tried to engage in some fiscal constraint. Are we going to be elegant enough to do it in a way where we can explain to the American people, if we do something smart today, we do not get crushed tomorrow? But small movements in interest rates start to consume everything in this government. And so here's an example. And this is, so I told you the 20-year yesterday went over 5%. Futures market, if anyone's a real geek, if you take a look at futures market on the 10-year sovereign, some of the futures market between now and through spring actually expect a 5% interest rate. If that 5%, and remember, that's still, what, a point and a quarter lower than the historic average when you get rid of the previous decade, which was just sort of fake interest rates. If we were to go to 5% on U.S. debt, that's actually fairly normal. And that gets built in. Remember, we bring about $10 trillion to refinance, and the new so 5%. We go from a $13 trillion, almost $14 trillion debt expectation at current interest rates over the next 10 years to 22.7. It's almost $9 trillion additional from where interest rates were in December to where it looks like interest rates are going to be this spring. You just added $9 trillion in additional interest. That's called interest rate fragility. That is double just the interest rate exposure going back to even something that's below historic norm is double everything we're talking about doing in tax reform of extending the TCJA 2017 tax policy. It's double. This should be scaring the crap out of people around here. Why am I the only idiot running around with charts saying, are you paying attention to this? Are you watching what's happening in world debt markets right now? Does this make anyone nervous? Some of the articles are basically saying bond markets around the world are getting nervous loaning to sovereigns because they keep borrowing like crazy. Well, what's going on in China where they're borrowing like crazy? We're borrowing like crazy. There's only so much borrowable money in the world, and we're chewing it up. And the point of this one was, if we were to pretend, ignore the law, and just extend our spending policies we have today in functionally 9 budget years. 9.2% of the entire economy is just interest. We expect almost 7% of this year to be borrowing. But the concept of just your... Let me rephrase it because I just screwed that up. 9.2% of the entire economy will be debt, not interest. Debt. A couple of our economists basically say we're going to borrow about 7% of the entire economy this year. If we don't start to stabilize that and roll it down, you hit this interest spiral into the ground, because I'm going to show you a couple charts here, should scare the crap out of you, of how much of the taxes we take in from hardworking people, from things, is just paying interest. So let's make that a little more understandable. Mr. Speaker, some of us with gray hair sort of remember, Mr. Green laughs at me, there's this thing called the 70s, 80s, 90s, even 2000s before the Great Recession, and mean interest rates on U.S. debt was about 6. Okay, so just an example of what it means when you're carrying 36 trillion in debt. And understand, we're adding another trillion of debt about every 125 days. Let's say that again. Every 125 days, we basically tacking on another $1 trillion of borrowing. But if we went back to a historic average of 6, it'd be 11% of GDP in a decade. Oh, what if we went up to 9, which we had back in the 70s and 80s? You're at 18%. We're playing really dangerous games here. We've almost made the decision to make the world debt markets the ones in charge of America. Every second, we're borrowing about $70,000. Do you not think the retired couple, the foreign government, the big business, the rich person who are buying U.S. savings bonds, are you pretending they don't actually sort of care about what we do here and that we're going to make sure they get their money back? Or is it just all magic money? But understand what that 6%, and this is sort of the punchline of what I'm trying to communicate here. By 2034, that's 9 budget years from now, debt servicing at 6%, so back even below the historic average, rates would consume 45% of all tax receipts. Let's do that again. Imagine a world where 45% of all tax receipts that come into the government just are paying interest. Take this seriously. Look, I have a 9-year-old, and my wife, who's exactly my age, we also adopted another little boy, same birth mom. He's 2.5, cutest kid you've ever met. The little girl is brilliant and very loud. The math basically says my kids, your kids, will be part of the first generation in America to actually be poor. And to give you an idea how that math works, when little Matthew, who's 2.5 right now, basically is 23, 24. If you wanted to maintain baseline services in America as they are today, U.S. tax rates, every U.S. tax rate, tariffs, corporate, individual, everything has to double. 100% increase. And it's not pretend, it's called math. There's these little things you punch in, you can put batteries in them. Hell, you probably have one on your phone. It's math. But we're terrified to tell our voters the truth. Because people raise their eyebrows and get upset when you say, look, we got old as a society, we didn't have as many children, we made lots of promises, and we never set aside enough money for them. But we can disrupt the cost if we're willing to adopt modernization. You can cut stunning amounts of money from the delivery of health care, not by cutting services, but by adopting technology. Except, once again, the lobbyists are in the hallway to stop you from doing that because it would make them change their bureaucracies and their business models. But a number like this should make us all pucker. That if we just went back to normal interest rates, in 9 years, 45% of all of our tax receipts go into just interest. That's called interest fragility. It's the single thing that scares me the most in the society is we're no longer in charge. We've basically made the decision the debt markets are. So let's actually get a little more dystopian. And part of this is to make an impact. What if we went to 9% interest? It's happened. What would happen? Can you read this number? 83% of all tax receipts would go just to interest. And here's the reality of today. For every dollar we take in tax receipts, we spend $1.39. Yet, what we call discretionary, military has been substantially flat. All other non-defense discretionary is basically flat. Almost all the growth is two things, been healthcare and interest. Well, we can't do anything about interest. You know, the deal is the deal is the deal when we sell a bond. And healthcare, well, there's an army of lobbyists, once again, outside these walls, who will beat the absolute living blank out of us when we ask them to modernize, actually use technology. Even our brothers and sisters here are often defending not last decade's, but the decade before that's business models within healthcare. We don't have a choice. Open up your brains, hire a computer brain, hire some kid who's a data analyst, scientist, and start walking through the facts of what's going on, and then we have to do hard things. We're going to have to do a revolution on... Have you seen the numbers coming out of Medicare Advantage? Have anyone taken a look at those Wall Street Journal articles from the last year? Of the billions and billions and billions that they're documenting are functionally fraud and abuse? Are we going to be honest about it? And there's ways elegantly to fix it without beating the crap out of everyone. We just need to recognize our own problems. But once again, for every dollar the United States takes in tax receipts, we spend $1.39. And right now I need to go back to an oldie but a goodie, and I've done entire floor presentations repeatedly on this. You take all the tax hike proposals of our brothers and sisters on the left and score them for their economic effects, it produced about 1.5 of GDP of new tax receipts. You take, for our side, all the cuts we've talked about, almost all of them being in non-defense discretionary. It's about 1 point of GDP. Add those two together, that's what? 2.5. Congratulations. So everything the talking heads here do behind these microphones is 2.5%. We're borrowing 7% this year of the entire economy. And here's your crisis. The solutions sound really good in a television commercial, maybe an interview on cable television, and they're crap math. They don't get you anywhere close with what's necessary because it turns out the actual scale of the math, it's so far beyond just raise people's taxes, just slash and burn this. You need a revolution on how we deliver on our commitments. And why is that harder? I still can't get my head around here why that's harder. And once again, the single chart that makes people most angry. And it's already a year out of date. The numbers right now are much worse. CBO predicts that deficits of $115 trillion over 2024 to 2054. Social Security, Medicare, $124 trillion deficit. The rest of the budget has a $9 trillion surplus. See this? The spending and the interest cover. Spending and interest cover. Remember, Social Security has about 9 more years and the trust fund's empty. Are we going to fix it? Are we allowed to talk about it? But if you talk about it, the Democrats are going to run nasty ads about you. So somehow they're comfortable with the immorality of in 9 years we're going to double senior poverty in America. Because that's what's happening. But you're not allowed to talk about it because they'll attack you. They spent, what, a couple million beating the crap out of me because I care about saving Social Security. I care about not doubling senior poverty. Somehow lying about it is the political tactic of this place. They care so much more about power than saving our brothers and sisters. You already have a crisis right now of baby boomers. Inflation pushing them out of their housing. We see it, I think it was last year I saw the statistic on baby boomers, doubling of homelessness because they're being priced out of their homes because of inflation. That's the morality of this place, because we do crap economics, because we make public policy by our feelings instead of math. But the reality of it, if you look at the CBO projection, now this is a year and a half ago, so inflation, it's trimmed off a bit from their numbers. Interest rates substantially higher. These numbers are going to pop when they redo them because of the higher interest rates. Off of I was trying to do it, it's dangerous when I try to do these things off the top of my head, but I was coming in about 133, 136 trillion of borrowing over the 30 years because of the higher interest rates, and could be substantially higher if we were actually truly at 5 or 6. The point is, debate after debate after debate after debate, we stand here and we argue about the non-defense discretionary, which is like 13% of the spending. And even in this projection, it actually grows slower than tax receipts. So we're going to head towards doing reconciliation. We're going to try to do policy. We have a new president coming in that has a vision of growth for the country. Are we, as the board of directors, as the founding fathers designed it, going to step up and do our job and actually save the future? Are we going to avoid the hardest thing we do, and that's telling the truth to our voters? And maybe even telling the truth to each other. There's still hope. But one of our economists actually has this chart he's been working and saying, you may only have 3 or 4 more years if interest rates keep moving up, or it's almost too late. You can't work yourself out of the higher interest rate cycle, because the additional debt, the interest rate, the additional debt, the interest rate. And I think it was a year ago, we actually had a couple months, 3 or 4 months, where we had to borrow money to cover our borrowing. Mr. Speaker, there's hope. There's a way to make the math work. There's a way to do it in a moral fashion. It's just when you have a complex problem, turns out the solutions are complex. Is the modern Congress capable of doing complexity? With that, I yield back.